Chapter 1. A Stranger in the Storm. The weather on Alpha Sierra, a remote and mostly desolate moon, was as unforgiving as it was unpredictable. For Amos Grady, a retired mechanic and former Galactic scout, the storm raging outside his small cabin was nothing unusual. Living alone on the edge of the wastelands meant dealing with brutal winds, sudden sandstorms, and bitter cold. Amos didn't mind. In fact, he preferred it this way. After years of chaos and war, the solitude gave him peace. The cabin was a modest structure, built by Amos himself from salvaged starship parts and whatever scraps he could barter for in the nearby settlement. Inside, it was warm and inviting, the hum of an old generator powering the lights and a small stove. Amos sat in his creaky armchair, a mug of hot herbal tea in hand, while the storm howled outside. The peace was shattered by the faint sound of something banging against the outer wall of the cabin. Amos frowned, setting his mug down on the table beside him. At first, he thought it might be debris carried by the wind, but the sound came again louder this time, and more deliberate. A series of sharp knocks. Who in the blazes would be out in this storm? Amos muttered to himself, rising slowly from his chair. He grabbed a flashlight and his old plasma wrench, more out of habit than necessity. The moon was sparsely populated, and visitors were rare, especially unannounced ones. Opening the heavy metal door, Amos was greeted by a gust of freezing wind and the sight of a hooded figure, their form barely visible beneath layers of tattered fabric. They collapsed into the doorway, their legs giving out as Amos instinctively reached out to catch them. Hey, easy there," he said, his gruff voice softening as he pulled the figure inside. The storm's icy bite followed them briefly before Amos managed to shut the door. "What in the stars are you doing out here?" The figure didn't respond immediately, their bodies shivering violently. Amos helped them to a nearby bench and pulled back the hood, revealing a face that was unmistakably alien. The visitor. Her skin was a pale lavender hue, faintly luminescent, with delicate patterns that shimmered faintly under the cabin's light. Her silver hair clung to her face, damp from the storm, and her eyes large and luminous blinked sluggishly as she tried to focus. "Water," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Amos quickly fetched a canteen, tilting it gently to her lips. She drank greedily, her trembling subsiding slightly as the warmth of the cabin began to take effect. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice melodic but tinged with exhaustion. She looked up at Amos, her golden eyes locking onto his. I didn't know where else to go." "Well, you found the right place," Amos said, kneeling beside her to check for injuries. "Looks like you've been through hell." She nodded weakly. My ship crashed. I've been wandering for days." "Crashed, huh?" Amos frowned, glancing at her tattered clothing and the faint burns on her arms. "Must have been a rough landing. Where's the rest of your crew?" Her gaze dropped to the floor. "Gone," she said softly. "I'm the only one left." Amos felt a pang of sympathy but didn't press further. Instead, he stood and grabbed a blanket, draping it over her shoulders. "Well, you're safe now. Storm's not letting up anytime soon, so you'd best rest here for the night." She looked at him with a mix of gratitude and hesitation. "Thank you. I don't have anything to offer in return." Amos waved her off. "Don't worry about that. Name's Amos, by the way." "Liara," she replied, her lips curving into a faint smile. "I'm Liara." A quiet night. As the hours passed, Liara regained some of her strength, though it was clear she was still recovering. Amos prepared a simple meal, synth protein stew, and some bread he had baked earlier in the week and insisted she eat. She hesitated at first, but eventually accepted, her hunger overpowering her reluctance. "Not much, but it's better than nothing," Amos said, watching her cautiously. "You got any allergies?" "Can't say I've ever cooked for someone from wherever you're from." Liara shook her head. "This is fine. Thank you." Amos nodded, satisfied, and leaned back in his chair. "So, Liara, you said your ship crashed. What were you doing out here? Alpha Sierra's not exactly a prime vacation spot." Liara hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the window where the storm raged on. "I was running." "Running?" Amos raised an eyebrow. "From what?" Her expression darkened. "It's complicated." Amos didn't push. He knew better than to pry into someone else's troubles, especially when they were clearly carrying the weight of the galaxy on their shoulders. Instead, he changed the subject. Well, whatever you're running from, you'll be safe here for now. Storm should blow over by morning, and then we can figure out a plan. Liara nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. You're very kind. Most wouldn't bother helping someone like me. Someone like you? Amos frowned. A person in need? That's all I see. Her eyes softened, and for the first time, she looked at him without the guarded tension she had carried since her arrival. Thank you, Amos. Don't mention it, he replied, finishing his tea. Now, get some rest. You look like you've been through enough for one lifetime. An ominous feeling. As the night wore on, Amos found himself unable to sleep. Something about Liara's presence tugged at the edges of his thoughts. It wasn't just her otherworldly appearance or her cryptic answers. It was the sense that she was hiding something. He sat in his chair, staring into the dying embers of the stove's fire, when a faint sound caught his attention. Turning his head, he saw Liara standing near the window, her hands pressed against the glass as she stared out into the storm. You should be resting, Amos said, his voice low. Liara flinched, turning to face him. I couldn't sleep. Amos stood and approached her, his concern deepening. Something bothering you? She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. I'm not used to being around others. It's been a long time since I felt safe. Well, you're safe now, Amos said firmly. No one's gonna hurt you here. Liara looked up at him, her golden eyes shimmering with unspoken emotion. You don't understand. It's not just them I'm afraid of. It's me. Before Amos could ask what she meant, a faint tremor ran through the cabin. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to set Amos on edge. What was that? He asked, his voice sharp. Liara's expression turned pained, and she took a step back. I didn't want this to happen, she said softly. I thought I could control it. Control what? Amos demanded, his unease growing. Liara's glowing patterns flared brightly, and a sudden heat filled the room. I'm sorry, she whispered. It's my mating season. The chapter ends with Amos staring in shock as Liara's true nature begins to emerge, leaving him grappling with the implications of what he has just learned. Chapter 2. The Awakening. Amos stood frozen in the dim light of his cabin, staring at Liara as her glowing patterns pulsed across her lavender skin. The heat in the room seemed to intensify, and her golden eyes shimmered with an unearthly energy. She took a step back, her expression a mixture of guilt and something Amos couldn't quite place, fear, perhaps, or even desperation. What do you mean? Mating season? Amos asked, his voice low and cautious. Liara clutched the edge of the windowsill, her breaths coming in shallow gasps. My species. We're tied to our cycles. It's not something we can control, not entirely. When the cycle begins, it intensifies everything: our senses, our emotions, our instincts. She paused, her glowing eyes locking onto Amos. It's why I ran. I thought I could escape it. Amos ran a hand over his weathered face, trying to process her words. So, this cycle, it's biological? Yes, Liara replied, her voice trembling. But it's not just that. It's dangerous. If I can't manage it, I might lose control. Her confession sent a chill down Amos's spine. Lose control how? Liara turned away, her glowing patterns flickering faintly. You don't want to know. The unseen threat. Amos took a step toward her, his instinct to help overriding his unease. Look, I don't know much about alien biology, but I'm not about to throw you out into a storm just because things got complicated. Tell me what I can do to help. Liara shook her head, her silver hair catching the dim light. You don't understand. My species isn't like yours. When the cycle takes hold, we bond. And if the bond is incomplete, it can dash. She stopped, her hands trembling. It can destroy us. Amos frowned, his concern deepening. Destroy you? How? It's a feedback loop, Liara explained, her voice barely above a whisper. Our energy builds and builds until it overwhelms us. Without release, it burns through us. From the inside out. Amos stared at her, his mind racing. He had heard strange stories during his years as a galactic scout, tales of alien customs and biology that defied human understanding. But this was something else entirely. How long do we have before it gets dangerous? Amos asked, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Liara hesitated, then glanced at him with a mix of gratitude and regret. Hours. Maybe less. A plan forms. Amos rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. All right, he said finally. Let's think this through. Is there a way to, I don't know, slow it down? Suppress it? There are techniques, Liara admitted. Meditation, isolation. But they only work if the cycle hasn't fully started. I've already suppressed it for days. Now it's too strong. Amos nodded slowly, his mind working overtime. Okay, so suppression's out. What about a solution? Is there a way to complete the cycle safely? Liara looked at him, her golden eyes searching his face. There is, but it requires a bond. A partner. Amos froze, his weathered face betraying a flicker of shock. A partner? Liara nodded, her expression earnest. It doesn't have to mean anything. It's biological, instinctual. Once the bond is complete, the energy will stabilize. Amos stared at her, his heart pounding. The implications of her words were clear, but they raised 1,000 questions he didn't know how to ask. He was an old man, retired and far removed from the chaos of galactic politics and alien customs. Yet here he was, faced with a choice that could mean life or death for the fragile being standing before him. And if we don't? He asked quietly. Liara's glowing patterns dimmed, her shoulders slumping. Then I die. Rising tensions. The storm outside raged on, the howling wind a stark contrast to the silence inside the cabin. Amos paced the room, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of the situation. Liara watched him from her seat by the window, her glowing eyes filled with a mix of hope and apprehension. Look, Amos said finally, turning to face her. I don't know much about your people, but I do know one thing: I am not about to let you die. Liara's eyes widened, a faint glimmer of hope crossing her face. You mean, you'll help me? Amos nodded, though his expression remained serious. If it's the only way to keep you alive, then yeah. But you're gonna have to walk me through it. I'm flying blind here. Liara smiled faintly, though there was still a hint of sadness in her expression. Thank you, Amos. I didn't expect kindness. Not from a human. Don't read too much into it, Amos muttered, his gruff demeanor hiding the warmth he felt. I've just got a soft spot for lost causes. Liara chuckled softly, the sound like a melody. Then I'm lucky you found me. The bond. As the storm began to subside, Liara explained the process of bonding. It was a delicate balance of physical proximity and shared energy, a melding of their life forces that would stabilize her condition. Amos listened carefully, his brow furrowed as he tried to grasp the alien concepts she described. You sure this is gonna work? He asked, his skepticism evident. It will work, Liara said firmly, but it requires trust. Without it, the bond can't form. Amos hesitated, then nodded. All right, let's get this over with. Liara guided him to the center of the room, where the faint glow of her patterns began to intensify. She placed her hands on his, their warmth surprising him, and closed her eyes. Just breathe, she said softly. Let the energy flow. Amos did as she instructed, his breath slow and steady. At first, he felt nothing, but then, a faint warmth spread through him, growing stronger with each passing moment. It wasn't unpleasant, more like the feeling of standing in the sun after a long winter. The room seemed to blur around them, the lines between reality and something deeper beginning to fade. Amos could feel Liara's presence, not just physically but emotionally, as though her thoughts and feelings were brushing against his own. You're doing well, Liara murmured, her voice distant but comforting. Just a little longer. The storm within. The bond was intense, far more than Amos had anticipated. He could feel the weight of Liara's emotions, her fear, her pain, and her overwhelming loneliness. It was almost too much to bear, but he refused to let go. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the energy stabilized. Liara's glowing patterns dimmed, their pulsing rhythm slowing to a gentle cadence. She opened her eyes, her expression one of relief and gratitude. It's done, she said softly. The cycle is complete. Amos exhaled, his body trembling from the experience. You weren't kidding about that being intense, he said, managing a faint smile. Liara laughed, a sound that was both joyful and weary. You saved my life, Amos. I'll never forget that. Yeah, well, Amos said gruffly, though his eyes softened. Guess we're even now. Chapter 3. The Intruders. The storm had calmed, leaving the world outside Amos's cabin eerily quiet. The air was crisp and still, the only sound the faint hum of his generator and Liara's steady breathing as she rested on the bench. Amos sat at his small dining table, nursing a cup of tea and trying to process everything that had happened. The bond they had formed still lingered in his chest, a warmth that felt foreign and oddly comforting. Liara stirred, her silver hair catching the soft morning light as her golden eyes opened. She blinked a few times before focusing on Amos, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You stayed up all night, she said softly. Didn't feel right leaving you alone after all that, Amos replied, his voice gruff but warm. How are you feeling? Liara sat up slowly, her glowing patterns dim but steady. Better. Much better. You did more than save my life, Amos. You stabilized something I thought I'd never control. Glad to hear it, Amos said, taking a sip of his tea. But I get the feeling this isn't the end of your troubles. Liara's smile faded, replaced by a look of unease. You're right. They'll come for me. Who's they? Amos asked, his brow furrowing. Before she could answer, the cabin's proximity alarm blared, a sharp, grating sound that made Amos's stomach drop. He shot to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for the plasma wrench he kept by the door. Speak of the devil, Amos muttered, his eyes narrowing. Stay here. Uninvited guests. Amos stepped out onto the porch, the morning sun casting long shadows across the barren landscape. At the edge of his property, 3 figures approached a trio of tall, armored beings with sleek, black helmets and glowing red visors. Their movements were unnervingly synchronized, their weapons gleaming in the light. Who the hell are you? Amos called out, his voice carrying over the still air. One of the figures stepped forward, their voice cold and mechanical. We're here for the fugitive. Hand her over, and you won't be harmed. Amos tightened his grip on the plasma wrench, his jaw clenching. Sorry, but I don't take kindly to strangers barging onto my land and making demands. The lead figure tilted their head slightly. You don't understand the danger she poses. That girl is a threat to the stability of this system. She doesn't look like much of a threat to me, Amos shot back. If you've got a problem with her, you can explain it to me first. The figure raised their weapon, a sleek energy rifle that hummed ominously. This is your last warning, human. Hand her over, or we'll take her by force. Amos's eyes narrowed. You can try. The attack. The first shot whizzed past Amos's head, slamming into the side of the cabin and leaving a scorch mark on the metal. He ducked behind a support beam, cursing under his breath. Damn it! Liara, stay down. Inside the cabin, Liara crouched behind the table, her glowing patterns flaring as her fear and frustration grew. She could feel the bond between her and Amos, the faint echo of his emotions mixing with her own. He was determined, but she could sense his fear not for himself, but for her. Amos, she called out, her voice trembling. You can't fight them alone. Watch me. Amos shouted back, firing a makeshift energy pulse from his plasma wrench. The shot hit one of the intruders square in the chest, sending them sprawling to the ground. The remaining 2 advanced, their movements fluid and precise. One fired a volley of energy blasts, forcing Amos to retreat into the cabin. He slammed the door shut, panting as he braced it with a heavy metal beam. They're not backing down, Amos said, glancing at Liara. You got any tricks up your sleeve? Liara's eyes glowed brighter, her patterns pulsing rhythmically. I can try to disrupt their systems, but I'll need time. Time's not something we've got a lot of, Amos muttered, peeking through the window as the intruders approached the cabin. Do what you can. I'll hold them off. Liara's power. Liara closed her eyes, focusing on the bond she shared with Amos. She could feel his energy steady, grounded, and strong and used it as an anchor to stabilize her own. The warmth in her chest grew, spreading outward as her glowing patterns flared brighter. Outside, the intruders prepared to breach the cabin. One of them raised a device that emitted a high-pitched whine, and Amos realized too late that it was a sonic disruptor. The blast shattered the window, sending shards of glass flying as the door buckled under the force. Liara, now would be a great time for that trick, Amos shouted, his ears ringing. Liara's eyes snapped open, blazing with golden light. She thrust her hands forward, releasing a wave of energy that rippled through the cabin and out into the open. The intruders froze mid-step, their armor crackling with sparks as the pulse disrupted their systems. Amos watched in awe as the remaining two collapsed to the ground, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, turning to Liara. "Remind me not to get on your bad side." She managed a faint smile, though her breathing was labored. "It won't last. We need to leave." Amos nodded, grabbing his gear and a few supplies. "There's an old transport buried out back. It's not pretty, but it'll get us out of here." On the run, the transport was a battered hovercraft, its hull patched with mismatched plates of metal. Amos powered it up, the engine sputtering to life as he and Liara climbed aboard. As they sped away from the cabin, Liara glanced back, her expression heavy with guilt. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to drag you into this." "Don't be," Amos replied, his voice firm. "You didn't ask for any of this. And besides, I've been looking for a reason to leave that cabin for years." Liara managed a small smile, but it quickly faded as a warning signal blared from the transport's console. "They're following us." Amos glanced at the scanner, his jaw tightening. Several more figures were closing in, their sleek crafts cutting through the air with ease. "They're persistent. I'll give them that," he muttered, gripping the controls. "Hold on. This is gonna get bumpy." The transport swerved sharply as Amos pushed it to its limits, the terrain below a blur of rocky outcroppings and narrow ravines. Liara closed her eyes, focusing her energy as she prepared for another pulse. "We can't outrun them," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We have to fight." Amos nodded, a faint grin tugging at his lips. "Good thing I packed a few surprises." The chapter ends with Amos and Liara preparing to make their stand, the bond between them growing stronger as they face overwhelming odds. Their journey is far from over, but together, they're determined to survive. Chapter 4. The Stand. The hovercraft roared over the jagged terrain of Alpha Sierra, its aging engine struggling to keep up with the strain Amos was putting on it. The transport's scanner blared incessantly, marking the relentless pursuit of their enemies' 5 sleek craft closing the distance with terrifying precision. Their dark, angular designs glinted ominously under the pale light of the planet's twin moons. Liara gripped the edges of her seat, her glowing patterns pulsing erratically as she fought to contain her panic. "We can't keep running," she said, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "They'll catch us eventually." "I know," Amos replied, his grizzled face set in grim determination. "But I'm not letting them take you without a fight." He veered the hovercraft sharply to the left, skimming the edge of a narrow canyon. Dust and rocks sprayed into the air as he pushed the vehicle harder, his hands gripping the controls with practiced precision. Liara glanced at him, her glowing eyes flickering with a mix of fear and admiration. "You're surprisingly good at this," she said, her tone light despite the situation. "Not my first chase," Amos replied with a faint smirk, "but I'd rather not make it my last." The console beeped urgently, signaling the imminent arrival of their pursuers. Amos cursed under his breath and slowed the hovercraft as they reached the edge of a large plateau. The terrain ahead was flat and open, perfect for an ambush. "This is where we make our stand," Amos said, cutting the engine and grabbing his plasma wrench and a satchel of improvised explosives. "They won't expect us to fight back." Liara climbed out of the hovercraft, her glowing patterns intensifying as she stepped onto the rocky ground. "You're not alone in this, Amos. I can help." Amos hesitated, then nodded. "All right, just stay close and be ready to hit them hard when the time comes." The battle begins. The first enemy craft descended with a menacing hum, its sleek form hovering a few feet above the ground. The side hatch slid open, and 3 armored figures emerged, their weapons trained on Amos and Liara. "Stand down and surrender the fugitive," the lead soldier commanded, their voice amplified by their helmet speakers. This is your last warning. Amos snorted, hefting his plasma wrench over his shoulder. Funny, I was about to say the same thing. Before the soldier could respond, Amos hurled one of his explosives at their feet. The device detonated with a deafening roar, sending a shockwave that knocked the soldiers off their feet and damaged the craft's landing gear. Amos followed up with a blast from his plasma wrench, targeting the engine and sending sparks flying. The remaining enemy craft opened fire, their energy bolts scorching the ground around Amos and Liara. Amos dove for cover behind a large boulder, motioning for Liara to do the same. They're flanking us, Liara shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Not for long, Amos muttered, pulling out another explosive. Cover me. Liara closed her eyes, focusing her energy as the glowing patterns on her skin brightened. She stepped out from behind the boulder and thrust her hands forward, releasing a wave of shimmering light that rippled through the air. The nearest craft faltered, its systems flickering as the pulse disrupted its controls. Nice work, Amos called, taking advantage of the distraction to lob another explosive. The device struck the craft's hull, the ensuing explosion reducing it to a smoking wreck. A desperate gamble. Despite their initial success, the remaining enemy forces regrouped quickly, their numbers and firepower overwhelming. Amos and Liara fought valiantly, but it was clear they were outmatched. We can't hold them off forever, Liara said, her voice strained. There are too many. Amos gritted his teeth, his mind racing. He spotted a narrow crevice at the edge of the plateau, a potential escape route if they could reach it. We don't need to fight them all, he said. We just need to get out of here. He grabbed Liara's hand and pulled her toward the crevice, their footsteps kicking up dust as they ran. The enemy soldiers gave chase, their weapons firing relentlessly. Liara stumbled, her energy waning from overuse, but Amos caught her and kept moving. Almost there, he shouted, his voice barely audible over the sound of gunfire. They reached the crevice just as the enemy forces closed in. Amos turned and fired one last shot with his plasma wrench, buying them enough time to slip into the narrow passage. The soldiers hesitated, their bulky armor making it difficult to follow. This way, Amos said, guiding Liara deeper into the crevice. The rocky walls closed in around them, the sound of their pursuers fading as they moved further away. The final confrontation. The crevice opened into a hidden cavern, its walls shimmering with bioluminescent crystals. Amos and Liara stopped to catch their breath, their bodies battered and bruised but still standing. They'll find us, Liara said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's only a matter of time. Then we make sure they regret it, Amos replied, his tone unwavering. He set up his remaining explosives at the entrance to the cavern, creating a makeshift trap. If they come through here, they'll be walking into a world of hurt. Liara nodded, though her expression remained grim. Amos, thank you for everything. Amos glanced at her, his gruff demeanor softening. Don't thank me yet. We're not out of this mess. The sound of footsteps echoed through the cavern, signaling the arrival of their pursuers. Amos readied his plasma wrench, his heart pounding as the first soldier appeared in the entrance. Get ready, he said to Liara, his voice steady. Liara stepped forward, her glowing patterns flaring brighter than ever. I am ready. As the enemy forces entered the cavern, Amos detonated the explosives, the blast shaking the ground and sending rocks tumbling from the ceiling. Liara unleashed a final surge of energy, the wave of light blinding and disorienting their attackers. When the dust settled, the cavern was silent. The enemy forces lay incapacitated, their weapons and armor rendered useless by Liara's energy pulse. A new beginning. Amos and Liara emerged from the cavern, the morning sun casting a warm glow over the landscape. The air was still, the threat finally behind them. What now? Liara asked, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Amos smiled faintly, his eyes scanning the horizon. We keep moving. There's a lot of galaxy out there, and I figure we've got some time before they come looking for us again. Liara returned his smile, her golden eyes shining with hope. Wherever we go, I'll follow. The story ends with Amos and Liara setting off into the unknown, their bond stronger than ever as they face the challenges ahead together.